Hello and welcome to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast with me, your host, Shiv Sengupta. For those who are not familiar with me, I'm the author of the Advaitaholics Anonymous books, Sobering Insights for Spiritual Addicts, and a manifesto for spiritual anarchy, published by New Sarum Press. They're available through Amazon in Kindle and paperback formats, and you can find them by clicking the links in the description below. Both these books have had a big impact and found great support among many veteran seekers for their willingness to critique spiritual culture, which in my view can act as a decoy designed to keep our vision perpetually focused away from what is most evident. However, my purpose with the Spiritually Incorrect podcast series is to connect and engage with other writers, thinkers, and spiritual teachers in the industry who don't necessarily fall into nor subscribe to the traditional guru stereotype. The idea is to explore some of the topics I cover in my books beyond the realm of my own opinions on the matter. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome my next guest, whom some of you may be familiar with. He's the author of the popular book, No Self, No Problem: How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. Welcome, Chris Niebauer.
Hey, great to be here.
So, Chris, did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Niebauer, yep, that's it.
Okay, good. Okay, good. I wasn't entirely sure, but just realized as I was saying your name, I had to really double check with Chris if I have his last name right. But I'm glad I got that correct. So, Chris, you reached out to me a couple of weeks ago, maybe I want to say about 3-4 weeks ago, and we decided it'd be a great opportunity for us to meet and chat publicly. Could you tell me, how did you hear about this podcast? Because it started just very recently. We've done about 7 episodes so far.
I think it was something on Facebook. I just stumbled across either a post or something on your books. And to me, the title just sounded so intriguing. I had to do a little investigating. And the title of the podcast, too, was very interesting. And so I just kind of did a little exploring. And then I thought, well, I'll send you a text, see what happens. And here we are.
Yeah, it's great because most of the guests I've had on the show, other than maybe the first couple of podcasts, have all reached out to me saying, hey, this sounds like an interesting deal, because there are a lot of podcasts in this genre. And I'm sure you've been on a bunch yourself. And they all seem to come at it from a certain angle. And the purpose of this podcast is to try and not necessarily confirm what everybody already believes, but try to deconstruct it. And this is why I try to engage with people of different backgrounds, right? Your background is in neuropsychology, correct?
Yeah, my PhD was basically the left and right sides of the brain. And I've continued to use that as a foundation to go off of. And I found it to be really useful, and it connects with people. You don't have to be a neuropsychologist to know we have 2 sides, the left and right side of the brain, and that they're really different. And while some of it kind of got to the level of being myths, I mean, I think, the popular press probably took it a little too far, but there's still an underlying major difference in the 2 sides of the brain and how that affects our experience of being a human and the radical different experiences that we have. And so it's a great pointer. And I'll continue to use it until, something else comes along.
Yeah, and that's a pointer that, I've used in the past as well, faced a little bit of criticism for it as well, because of what you mentioned, the popular press. They take hold of a concept and then they beat it to death, right? In a way that's the only way to understand it. So we can visit that in a little bit from now, but I want to get, what's your backstory and how this book came about? What was it that kind of started the whole process off for you?
Yeah, I was, a teen, maybe not even 19, 20, and just was thrown into a massive neurosis. And I probably had some hints of this even as a really young kid. But when my father died, it just, the impact of death, it really took me off guard. I mean, obviously I had an intellectualization of death, but when your first experience of someone dying, it takes it to a much more, a deeper level. And for me, that just sort of ripped apart any kind of security I had in life. And I saw death as the enemy and was absolutely terrified that I was going to die at any moment, lived in continual neurosis. Probably looking back on it, I should have actually went into therapy instead of thinking of getting a degree in psychology. That shows you how intellectual I was. I thought, there's some way of, figuring this whole big mystery out. And actually the degree in psychology was pretty useful. It was okay. And then certainly figuring out the brain, I went on to grad school and that helped. But for me, the real powerful transformative stuff came from Eastern philosophy. That just filled in the gap. It really, it was, when I started reading it, I just couldn't stop. And it was almost as if they had offered, it's like, okay, we know that they connected with me and they're like, we know what you're dealing with. And here's a couple hints, here's some pointers. And, so many spiritual teachers have been there themselves. And, you get this thought, and then that's combined with the neuroscience. And so I thought, well, here you see this door opening and you say, well, that's a possible way out. So I just continued, finished the PhD, and then went off and was a professor and just teaching ordinary classes. And got really sick one night with a life-threatening throat infection, and had insomnia for a week. And I couldn't sleep. And I just remember like, what am I going to do? I'm up all night. And I just started writing. And it was kind of amazing to me how, I wasn't really thinking. I always feel like I was just a secretary. I was just taking notes. And the stuff just, the whole outline of the first book came to me, and just like a whole package. And all I was doing was like filling in the spots, filling in and doing like the final touches and stuff. And then that was the Neurotics Guide. And I published that, and it did okay for self-publish. But it was also, sometimes I think about when people do self-publishing, I probably made more mistakes. I think I made every mistake a first-time self-publisher makes. And so, but it was popular enough that a couple people read it, and eventually a publisher contacted me, and then we got into No Self, No Problem. And that one turned out to be a much better version of it, a much more readable version, a much more connectable for a lot of people.
So for readers who are not familiar with that book, what would you say is the fundamental sort of message in that book where you were connecting Buddhism to neuropsychology, and what is the connection point there?
Really, the thing that stood out, and this is back when I was in grad school, was the whole notion of the left brain interpreter. That really just, and it connected with me so much that I couldn't believe that it wasn't like on the news every night. I thought it would be like this massive revolution for humanity, this paradigm shift where we discovered, so this is back in the 70s, and anyone listening to this, most of your listeners probably have heard a little bit about the split brain patients who, and it's absolutely literal, the corpus callosum, the connecting fiber between the left and right sides of the brain, was surgically severed. So functionally, the left and right sides of the brain no longer communicated. And what they had discovered in the lab is that the left brain had this natural tendency to just confabulate. It just made up stories, and it did so effortlessly that's why they called it the interpreter, because it would look around, try to assess what's going on based on the limited data that it has, and it would make up a story. And it believed the story. It was absolutely, there was no doubt, there was no skepticism. It was just absolute, this is reality. And to me, the split brain patients just, in particular, Gazzaniga, who was one of the major researchers, he even started his second book, one of his early books, and he made this link between the how the left brain confabulated and the idea of the self. that the self is just a story, a confabulation. And to me, that was remarkable because I'm like, I had learned enough from Buddhism that, the Buddha's second lecture on no self, I'm like, wow, that's a pretty amazing thing that we've got this neuroscientist here who is finding out in the lab what the Buddha said 2,500 years ago, that the self is a fiction. But now we've got a very, interesting piece of the puzzle, that it's the left side of the brain that seems to be responsible for creating that fiction and believing it and never having one bit of doubt in any of it.
Yeah, it's, I had this firsthand knowledge of this when I experienced what I call my awakening experience in my 20s after a long period of depression. And that left brain thinking, interpreting side of my brain basically shut down for a 4-month period. There's no vocalization of thoughts in my brain, which I found very strange at first, right? Because it's up until that point, I had a constant and nonstop interior chatter, a lot of it critical and putting me down, all of that, which led to depression and anxiety. But when that stopped, simultaneously, I noticed how my sense of being seemed to bleed into everything. And there's a sense of connection with everything, very deep sense of connection. The way I would interpret that now is not that I lost my sense of self, but that the boundaries of that self had changed. What I had before was a self-concept, and now my self-concept had disappeared. But there's still a very fundamental sense of existing, this sense of being, but that being wasn't a Shiv, wasn't a man, wasn't a Canadian, wasn't a dad, whatever, those labels. So would you, in your mind, when you talk about the self, how do you define that self? Is it that the brain, in your opinion, is inventing that we exist in the first place, that sense of existence itself? Or is it the identity around that existence that is being confabulated?
Well, one of the things about the left side of the brain, and this isn't very popular, I don't know why. To me, I think it's one of the greatest connections to Maya, that the idea of illusion that we could come to. And that is the left brain's talent for seeing the world categorically. And categories are fascinating things. There are ways that we split and divide the world and see separate things. And the interesting thing about categories is that there's no real tangible physical quality to them often. Categories are kind of like color, in the sense that they literally only exist in the mind. And they're useful. It'd be really difficult to watch imagine watching a football game and, just the fact that you got a bunch of people wearing the same uniform. Now, again, they may differ on a million other qualities, but there's one thing they have in common. They're wearing the same uniform. That allows us to put them all into one group and then everyone else into the other group. And it makes watching a football game, possible. I don't know if you could really watch one if everyone just showed up wearing whatever they felt like wearing. And so categories are these incredibly useful tools, but that's all they are. And the interesting thing, and think about what we've done with the world. We've categorized the world into countries, and it's very difficult. Categories penetrate our daily lives so much that we don't even often become aware that they're just fictions in the mind. And to me, that's what the self is. The self is just another one of these categorical boundaries that we've created. And there's a certain usefulness to it. It helps if I go, I pay my bills and I'll walk into what I call my house. And, there's certain functionality to it. But there's also a realization that all those categorical boundaries are just fictions of the mind. And I think when you get beyond that, and that's one of the things the right brain seems to be pretty good at. Instead of dividing the world into categories and separating, the right side of the brain makes connections and bridges, and it sees how everything is integrated into a whole. And so that's one of those experiences that people have. And when they stop seeing the world categorically, all of a sudden there's no place where I end and everything else begins. And, so often in science, we make these distinctions between, the organism and the environment. And we don't realize that there's just an organism-environment relationship. And it's really one big, system that's working together harmoniously. But the left brain comes in and, creates these fictitious ideas that I'm separate. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I would say the self is this categorical fiction created by the left brain based on the left brain's need to explain and interpret. And, we have this sensation, like right now, it feels like I'm looking out of the world through my, my eyes, and I hear this voice in the head, and I see these, my body does these actions, and the brain's trying to figure out what's behind all that. And so the self is a nice, neat story that explains all that. And of course, the cool thing about neuroscience is that they've been looking for the self in the brain for a really long time. I mean, if you get into the research on the self, I mean, so much debate, is it in the left or right? They couldn't even find if it was in the left or right side of the brain. But in the end, they couldn't find any hint of a self. And so they've come up short every time. And that's because, of course, there's nothing to find. But they have found what creates the idea of the self. And again, it's a combination of storytelling and seeing the world through categories that creates this very believable, I mean, this idea, when you say, well, the idea of the self, it's just an illusion. Well, it's a really persistent, it works really well. And that's why most human beings have gone through their existence never questioning if this self wasn't exactly what they thought it was.
Yeah, and it seems like the reason it's so persistent is because it exists and it relates to a certain persistent illusion outside of, the person, which is the illusion of society, right? And the self is playing a functional role within that setup. It's like being a starter or defender or a goalkeeper in a soccer game. Well, you need the rules of soccer and the whole setup of the field and the players and the referees and the audience in the stands and all of that for your role to have a function. And as long as that setup's there, your role is sort of persists. That's your job. It's when the game changes that the role changes. And I think that, when in times of crisis, the reason people have existential crises is because it relates to something in the setup outside that has changed in a way that they're not able to relate anymore. And they get sort of stuck in this, oh, well, who am I then if I don't have this parameter by which I can relate and identify myself, right? But I wonder, Chris, beyond the social level, is there a biological level at which even animals are feeling a rudimentary sense of self? Whereas, in the midst of a herd, you've got a bunch of, wildebeest moving around here in a herd and stampeding in the herd, and there's this herd mentality that sets in. But at the point at which it feels its own life is under a threat by a predator, it's able to separate from that herd and protect itself. I'm wondering if this is biologically programmed at a much lower level than the conceptual.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Are you familiar with the mirror test?
You may have mentioned something like that in your book. Right?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting test where it's a test for self-awareness. And sometimes they'll anesthetize an animal and they'll put a dot somewhere on its face, and so they can't feel it. And then there's a mirror. And if they look in the mirror and they think it's another animal, they don't, they respond how they would respond if it was another animal. But if they look in the mirror and say, that's me, they have an image of themselves, then they'll go and they'll sort of investigate what's going on. And it's interesting that not every species has this image of a self. And although they're always finding different versions of this, so at first it was people said, well, dogs and cats, they seem to fail this test all the time. Actually, I think that's why humans are so attracted to dogs and cats, because the self has a certain weightiness. It's a burden kind of thing. And we like to be around other species that are free from this idea of the self. I think it's kind of relaxing to be around another being who's just conscious without this self-image. and elephants and dolphins, and they all seem to have. But I think that might be a very high level of self. I mean, I like the way you put it because, I'm not sure that there was any magic place in evolution where the self came into being qualitatively different. I think you might be able to look at it as a smooth progression, with one exception. I do think that something happened in human evolution. There's a lot of debate about this. I would put it about 40,000 years ago. So Homo sapiens, our species, and they call it the cognitive revolution, where something happened where we just started to become really good thinkers. And I think that's something when the left brain kicked in, and it got a really good talent with two things, with language, but also got very good at categories. And it's very difficult to separate categories and language because that's what words are. If I say the word dog, I'm representing a category. I'm simplifying reality by taking a bunch of variations, and I'm just lumping them into one big group. So the left brain got really good at this. And I do think that humans, when it comes to the self, I think we are a little bit different, because it's not that your dog doesn't think, but I don't think your dog thinks as much of its thoughts as humans do. I think our cross to bear, our burden has been that, maybe we could, maybe even a mouse thinks. I mean, it certainly has cognitions to some degree. But there was something strange that happened to our species about 40,000 years ago, and it got us on this very abstract trip of overthinking. And then we see that happening like 40,000 years and and then we see it really intensifying, kind of like going on a curve. And then as soon as maybe industrial revolution happened, and then all of a sudden, social media and, I think if anything right now, we are burdened heavily by overthinking, when realistically, you could get by very successfully with maybe 1 hour of thought a day. That would work fine. You could function very well. And the rest of thoughts, they lead nowhere. They don't. In fact, they're typically very unproductive.
I think it was Alfred Korbisky who called. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. Korbisky, who called human beings time binders, in that we're able to weave these narratives, and through our story making, we're able to make these generational leaps of consistent story making. And that's been our success story, and how we are able to congregate and form communities of the vast numbers that we're able to now. That sort of, if you look at our global economy of 7.8 billion people, all functioning under one economy, it's all thanks to our ability to form these uniform stories that we all sign up and believe in to some extent, right? But it's very interesting what you were saying about that, because what I found is the human brain, the thought processes that continue through the day, and most of them are recursive, aren't they? They're just repeating the same thing over and over again. Part of that is an aspect of daydreaming. It's almost like it's kind of ruminating and chewing on its thought in order to really process and digest it. But a lot of it is also counterproductive, because you end up spinning your wheels in a way that it's not really getting you anywhere, right? Causes anxiety.
And there's actually a really good article on this. You could look; it's online. I think it's A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind. So they did some research on just mind wandering, and it turns out we do this all the time. It's to say that we mind wander 50% would be really conservative. In fact, it's interesting. There was only one thing that people were actually present for, one human act that people were actually present for. And you might be able to guess at that. For everything else, though, our mind wanders off. And statistically, they did some really cool calculations, and they were able to find that it was actually the mind wandering that made people unhappy. And of course, that's why I think the mindfulness movement is so popular right now, because all mindfulness is the opposite of mind wandering. And they've got this all mapped out neurologically here with the default mode network. It's a very interesting set of neural modules. And when we start mind wandering, these kick in, and these neuromodules kick in, and they start daydreaming, and they start fantasizing, and they take us away from reality. And the moment we come back to reality, then these modules slow down, and we become task-oriented, and that's mindfulness. And there's some really interesting work that seems to suggest that doing psychedelics, what it does is it shuts down that default mode network. And one of the reasons that it may decrease depression and anxiety is because anxiety and depression are so often the results of us just, thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking, and we think it's reality. That's the trick. How do you get out of your own mind? How do you get out of your own thinking? And
well, one solution I've seen using this is something Judy Cohen, for example, who I interviewed in the 3rd episode of this podcast. She talks about, because she's an artist as well, and she talks about how the creative mind can only come in and provide solutions when the left brain is not hyper-focused on that same problem. So one solution is to give the left brain something else to do, focus on some kind of other task, usually something quite practical, so that it can go off and chew on that for a while, kind of like tossing your dog a bone so it can be happy in the corner, chewing on the bone for a while the right brain can actually come in and bring in those creative solutions. And we've seen this happen with a number of creative people, how they'll have their eureka moments in the midst of doing something completely unrelated, right? So there seems to be some kind of value in that daydreaming, wandering of the mind, but not directly linked to the problem at hand. So I agree with you that overanalyzing, overthinking the problem at hand is not going to actually bring you any closer to solution. If anything, it's going to obscure it. I've seen this in my own life. But typically allowing that mind to then go and tackle something else, unrelated, something practical, something that the mind would be useful actually in tackling, like doing your taxes or whatever it might be, allows then that creative aspect of the mind to come in.
Yeah, that's a great point. When I talk about the mind, I actually called because a while back when I was talking about this 40,000-year-old program that kicked in and saved humanity. I mean, there's a reason. There used to be like 8 different types of humans on the planet, and now we're down to 1, Homo sapiens. I mean, we survived the evolution war, and maybe it's due to this program that's capable of problem solving and categorizing the world in simplistic ways. And we have to realize that 40,000 years ago, the world was really different. I mean, I didn't have the luxury. There wasn't a house I could sit in and just relax all day and have drive-throughs and have food. I mean, so what you were saying, I think, is a really interesting point, because the left brain really has nothing to do anymore. I mean, 40,000 years ago, it was continuously trying to outwit, and it was like the real game of Survivor, and it had to strategize, and it had to plan, and it had to talk to itself, and it had to figure the world out. Now, what has it got to do? And it looks like it really just ends up creating its own problem, so it has something to do. So I like the idea. I actually have something very similar I call distraction therapy, where again, you give the left brain something to do, and if you don't, it's going to invent some kind of terrible problem because it has to feel important. But if you can distract it with something, give it something to do, harmless, and so often it will just comply. It just really, it's not. So a lot of times people, when they look at the left brain or they look at the ego, they say the ego isn't your friend. The ego is some kind of enemy that we need to, fight. And it's like that, it's just there to protect this meat suit. It's a very old program just trying to get me through my day. But when you look at the world, how much we've changed in terms of, like, I'm very privileged in the sense that I don't worry about someone murdering me. I don't worry about, I can walk down the streets. I don't worry about being some like an animal attacking me and being something's lunch. And so there's a whole set of problems that are actually gone right now. And you think that would just say, well, why aren't we absolutely at peace? Why isn't some of the world, but it turned out to be the exact opposite. Some of the most well-to-do people end up having some of the most problems. And you say, well, how could that be? Again, if you look at the left brain and say, well, you're really good at this one task, but we're going to solve all your problems. I mean, it's going to invent things, and it's going to invent things that are going to seem just as real as those old problems seemed. And so it's always going to, it's always in that fight or flight mode.
Oh yeah, it seems like the left brain is stuck in that ancestral environment of life or death. Everything needs to be analyzed from life or death scenario. But really, we live in a world of trivial choices at this point. It's like, what color toothbrush should I buy, or am I buying an electronic toothbrush or an old school toothbrush, and why? Do I want to lose the ability to brush my own teeth? These are the kinds of stupid questions we're asking ourselves. At least I am asking myself sometimes. And really, none of that is a life or death. But when you do equate that to a life or death scenario, then suddenly you've opened up a Pandora's box of millions of life or death choices, because in a trivial environment, you have tons of trivial choices that you're faced with. And when that's the kind of environment you're in, it's terribly terrifying and threatening, because there's so many variables now. At least our ancestors had a few variables: weather, predators, clothing, about 5 or 6, you lock those down, you're pretty good. Now it's a million choices, none of them really important. But if we call them life or death choices, no wonder people are debilitated by anxiety or depression, right?
Oh, I agree. And we've got more choices now than we've ever had before. And 90% plus are just totally trivial. There's a really good article that looked at how we create our own problems. And it's another one you could find online pretty easily. And it has a really fancy title. I always forget it. But the task was just, press a button every time a blue dot appears. And you say, well, that's a pretty simple thing. And they had blue dots, and it went all the way into purple and all these other things. And of course, people pressed the button every time the blue dot came up. And then the researchers did something clever. They stopped showing blue dots. And you say, okay, well, people would just stop pressing the button. But they didn't. They redefined what a blue dot was. And so that, we're so good at finding a problem that we redefine it when it goes away. And they did it with a couple other things, even ethical. So one of the other studies, people had to read through an ethical article and see if it violated any ethics. And so they threw some articles at them, and they just had blatant violations of ethics. And of course, that's pretty easy to pick. But then they took away all the ethical problems. Now, again, you would expect, if we were rational creatures, you'd expect us to just turn these in and say, well, there's no more ethical problems. But we didn't. The subjects actually they redefined what an ethical problem was. And I think that, and the most fascinating thing about this research is that even when they told the subjects to expect this, they told them blatantly, like, look, we're going to take the problem away. It didn't change anything. They still did. And that shows that it's a hardwired program. It's an old program. I call it Mind 1.0 because I don't think it's ever been updated for 40,000 years. I think we're living with this ancient program that if it doesn't have a problem to solve, if you're not running from something and trying to find food, it's going to invent some kind of problem, and it's almost always, again, connected to the self, and we're living in this world where so many of these things like toothbrushes and all, it's such illusory problems, but you can't hit that at an intellectual level, because that's the interesting thing about the program. It has a built-in mechanism that if you try to intellectually deal with it, it has the ability to ignore all intellectual reason and come right back online. And that's why when you hear these stories of transformation, that kind of epiphany people have, that they were buying into illusion, it's never an intellectual process. It hits them. And it's a very mysterious thing that no one really can explain. And that's why a lot of the things that we call mysteries, the right brain, instead of trying to figure out a problem, I think the right brain is much better at embracing a mystery.
It's an important point about this idea of the self being an illusion, because I feel like this word illusion is also somewhat ill-defined, right? Because when we tend to use these words in terms of absolutes. And many people argue that even the humanistic biological viewpoint of the world is an illusion to some extent, because if you look at quantum physics and all of that, the world looks very, very different than these discrete entities and in interaction, all of that. In fact, they would, quantum physics would claim that objects don't even exist; they're just processes, and that's all there are. So I find that illusion is always relative to something, right? Just like, if I'm writing a story and I have a character in there named Chris, let's call the character Chris. And is Chris an illusion? Yes, from the point of view of the author writing the story. But Chris is obviously a real character in the story. So it's all context driven. And so I see the self as an illusion from the naturalistic standpoint. But from a social standpoint, not an illusion, because it's very functional. It's obviously achieving things in the social setup. And the social setup in itself is somewhat of a made-up illusion, like we just discussed. But where I struggle with a lot of people who are in the spiritual industry and seekers is that they're not able to grasp that nuance of illusion being a relative thing and still being a functional and useful aspect of our lives. It's almost like reality good, illusion bad, very binary. And if illusion is bad, then we need to get rid of it. And you cannot get rid of the self. That's like trying to just take away your ability to even have memory. Like, it's a function the brain performs. There are moments when that goes down and there are moments where it's amplified. But this idea of completely eliminating it I find it idiotic. And secondly, why would you want to? I feel like it would actually impair a person's ability to function in society.
And those great points. I mean, I really agree so much with that, because I'm giving one version of this, and you say, well, the self is an illusion, but I really like the way you elaborate that and point out something super valuable, that it's an illusion when we think about it as a solid thing, that is somehow part of the physical world. But when you think about it as a verb, so I like to think about the self more as a verb. It's just so like right now, I don't have a self. I'm selfing, like I'm Chrising, and the language doesn't work out real well, but I'm playing the character Chris right now. And that has a certain value to it. And we have so many of these selves. In fact, I actually have an exercise in the book. How many selves do you have in a day? Where you practice the selfing and you start to recognize that, it's just like, verbs are tricky things. Well, they're not things at all, right? That's why they're tricky. They're processes. And it's like if someone was running, and then you stopped and you said, okay, where's the run? Let me point to where the jog is at. And you couldn't find the physicality of it because it's a process. And science has always had a really tough time with this, because verbs are, they're tricky things. Science loves nouns. Science loves to be able to, because nouns you can dissect. Nouns you can separate and label in a really easy way, and you can see them. But when I say the self is an illusion, what I mean is in terms of some physical, stable thing, it's an illusion. But when you think about the self as a verb, then it has a wonderful flow to it, and I self all day, but the thing is, there's not one consistent self. So right now, I've got one useful self that's good for podcast, and then my kids, I could tell they just got home from school, and there'll be a totally different self that's going to come online with them, and then there'll be some other self. I'm going to pick up my guitar, and maybe when I'm playing my guitar, the self just sort of there's no real need for it, so it might just sort of disappear for a little while, and then some other self will come online if I have to send my taxes off or something. And so the self illusion to me is that there just isn't there's no self behind all these verbs. There's no noun that has any tangibility to it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not valuable. We have a kind of a bias, I think, in our culture where we like nouns are up here and verbs are somehow less. But I think verbs, and I actually went into this a little bit in my first book, that verbs are almost superior because they have no physicality to them, they're actually immortal. I mean, you think about the story of like Sherlock Holmes, like, technically that story can live, for infinity. All it takes is some awareness to reconjure it up, and then there it is. Same thing with music. It's just the tune, it's just the melody. And so in that sense, the self is more like a melody that I'm playing.
So why do you think it is that, in your opinion, Chris, that, in this industry that is a spiritual industry, and I'm not sure how exposed you've been to the industry itself, but I'm assuming to some extent, since, you are doing these kind of podcasts and things like that, that there's this persistent kind of implication. It's almost like the hard sell that the self can be transcended in a way that it no longer features in a person's life. It seems, whether overtly or subliminally, it does tend to be the kind of position from which a lot of this, the whole spiritual culture is operating from. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, in my own writing as an author and my own role, I sort of fell into this role. I didn't go out seeking it because I was in that mindset for a long time, thinking that was possible, and then believing a lot of these, ranging from gurus like, Rajneesh or Osho, who are like overtly saying they've enlightened, to the more, agnostic Alan Watts types. But even with Alan Watts, I felt like there's always a hint of a suggestion that something beyond what I was experiencing now is a possibility. And I fell into this role because I found that it's a persistent myth. It's not balanced enough. It's not nuanced enough. It's not letting people understand that the self is an illusion from one perspective, but it's functional from another, and they can coexist. The knowledge of its illusory nature and the willingness to continue selfing, as you're saying, as a verb, instead of being a crystallized self, which is where a lot of the problem comes in. That nuance either doesn't seem to be communicated, or if it is being communicated, it's being drowned out by the other stuff. Have you noticed this as well? And what is your take on it?
Well, when I look back to myself in my 20s, it was very seductive to consider that there was a simple way out. It was just very motivating to think that if I could just meditate, and I swear I have these memories of meditating and timing it, like if I just meditate an hour, like I'll get rid of this damn self thing. And then and of course the self is only an issue to the self. I mean, it's like the ego is just like making its own problems, and it wants itself to go away, but it really doesn't want itself to go away. It wants to enter that peaceful, it wants peace, but it doesn't see that it's the one stirring the pot. And so we desperately look for answers. And so I think that's a really, I mean, we're all drawn to it. And so it can create an industry where people will give, if I create some idea that there's some method that's going to eliminate, the unpleasant stuff in life. I mean, we're just really attracted to it, and I love, maybe my all-time favorite Alan Watts quote is the reason you want to be better is the reason why you're not. And I think he hit it. He hit a really and I think that's why Alan Watts has never really reached kind of the level that many other spiritual teachers have. He just laid it out a little bit too honestly. And that's why, like my first book, the subtitle was How the Left Brain Creates Unending Games of Self-Improvement, because that's the self-improvement game. And we don't realize that there's a real paradox to the self-improvement game. It's like me wanting to self-improve is the problem. And so if I could just, do away with the self-improvement game, I would absolutely have the improvement that I'm looking for. But that's a really, that's a tough book title, that's a tough, and so, I think there are steps, and I think people work at their own pace, and I think the idea of deconstructing the self, poking some holes through it, and realizing that it's not as stable as people think it is, deconstructing it a little bit. I think that's a great first step. It takes the seriousness away from the self. Because see, I really have no problem with the egos. I have no problem with selves and any of that. To me, it's the seriousness. It's the literal nature of it. And I think that the world has a wonderful metaphorical existence beyond the literal, and that's what the right brain is so talented at doing. And I think as soon as you shift, in fact, that's actually, I'm working on a book at some point, and I don't know if anyone else has come up with this idea. I kind of have to search through that first. But the way I look at the left and right sides of the brain right now is that the main function, what the left brain really does, is it takes things seriously, and it takes them literally. And again, that's one of the problems. It takes the self as a literal noun, as an object. The right side of the brain is far more playful, and it takes things metaphorically, and it realizes not to take anything at face value. And that's why, it's so good at poetry and metaphor and sarcasm. And so, but yeah, to get back to what you were saying, in terms of just this kind of oversimplification of the self, and I think that's a good. I mean, it's a place where so many of us started. I mean, I remember with some of the first experiences I had is that, the story that it wasn't like I thought it was, and I think that's actually it's a little off topic here, but so much of thinking. And when I talk about thinking, I'm talking about the left brain, how it constructs the world through categories and tries to figure the world out through interpretations. Thinking is a great tool, but I don't think reality is what we think it is. And I think that there's an amazing world beyond thought. Like I said at the beginning, you only need to think like an hour a day at best. And when you start getting in touch with that world, I think that I have this suspicion that that's where a lot of us are going. It's kind of so you get into the spiritual community, and you could say, well, there's a lot of different interpretations and stuff. But I think it was Meister Eckhart when he talked about theology. He said, all the theologians argue, but the mystics agree because they're not, arguing about definitions. And in that sense, I think a lot of us, we may actually be talking about the exact same stuff. It's just that we have to use words right now, and we have to use concepts. Like right now, it's a very good thing that I'm using my thinking mind. I don't want to turn my thinking mind off right now. It would be a mess. And so, it's really useful now. But the problem is there's just all the packages and paradigms and biases that come along with that. Sometimes people can be in the middle of an absolute, what appears on the surface to be a debate about things, but underneath it, they may be agreeing on the fundamental experiences that are just difficult to get really, as a writer, this is one of those things. I mean, how do all of us, so, if we're all writing about spiritual experiences, then language is a left brain function, and it has very little to do with these transcendent mystical experiences, but we're all forced to become writers in the sense that if I want to, there's no mind meld, the Vulcan mind meld. If I could just, connect directly to you, then we could, transmit experiences directly, but we're stuck with language. And that maybe to some extent creates this impression that there's a lot of differences out there.
And it seems like we're socially conditioned to flip the hierarchy of the right brain, left brain, and what roles they're best suited to. because I find that society keeps telling us that the left brain is the visionary and it can plan your life out for you. And it's the decision maker at those major crossroads in your life. Whereas I found it to be completely the opposite. And reorienting myself that way has been a bit of a journey, right? Like because it takes a certain amount of faith in your right brain, which cannot speak back to you. It doesn't rationalize, it actually doesn't use language to speak. There's no internal dialogue from the right brain. But I'll give you an example. A year and a half ago, I moved back to Canada from Japan, where I'd been living for 5 years at the time, right in the midst of the pandemic. And the decision to move to a part of Canada that we'd never been to before, didn't have a job yet, didn't have a place to live, didn't know anybody, in the midst of the pandemic with our family was extremely daunting. We sort of picked a spot on the map and we said, we're going for it. But that entire decision was driven by this right brain intuition that this was the time we needed to pull the trigger and this is where we needed to go. I can't rationalize to you, what the reasoning was or whether that reasoning was correct, except to say a year and a half later, my life couldn't be working out any better than I couldn't have imagined it working out better than it is right now. So there's the only way to really assess is after the fact. But this is that the left brain is good at figuring out next steps. And that's about it. What's the next step? Little task, it's task oriented. And that's what it's best suited for. But this general tuning into, what is required from the situation, from the environment, it's a much more holistic perspective. And in that sense, I've experienced, and I don't know how to necessarily articulate this in a rational way, which is why I hesitate, that there's a collaborative effort happening between the mind and the environment, and this exchange of information. That is the only way intuition could possibly work, because we're not actually sitting down and analyzing any data whatsoever, right? The way the left brain does. So I wanted to see, what's your experience with that in your own life?
Yeah, well, when we look at the research on attention, it's really clear. Like the left brain has this tiny little spotlight. And of course, think about language. It focuses on one word at a time. And generally, when we think one thought at a time. So everything about the left brain is confined down to this tiny little, part of the world. And the right brain seems to have this vast, far more extensive attentional ability where it gets the whole big picture. And then you think about, talk about a really interesting problem to throw at humanity. It's like here's the right brain. It knows the big picture. It can deal with 1,000 variables all working at once. It can't talk, though. It can't tell you anything about this, because the talk, you have to actually slow things down to one word at a time. And so it's kind of wonderful. I think it's a kind of a really interesting, almost purposeful paradox that the cosmos kind of threw at humanity just for fun, because it's one of those, impossible riddles, like a Zen koan. But I love the way you're talking about the use of intuition and how you can't think your way through life in terms of the big decisions. And students will ask me, well, should I get married? There's no way that tiny little spotlight has enough information that it can process the whole vastness of what's going on in your life right now. The right brain has a far better chance, even though it doesn't know how to tell you this. And that's why it doesn't tell you. The right brain is far more reliant upon emotions. And so people who have right brain damage, they just go emotionally flat. So the way the right brain speaks is through emotions. And that's why we get these feelings. And the left brain, again, it puts thinking up here and feelings down here. And so it always, and then we've been taught 100 times, don't you have to think and be logical and rational. And that's what defines us as humans. And so we get these feelings. So for example, like in my life, I've been an academic now since the 90s. And just recently, like a few weeks ago, a month ago right now, left academia. And sort of just, jumping off into, and hoping the bridge will appear, and there's no way to really like if you said, well, give me a rational, you know, I couldn't explain any reasoning behind that, except that faith or intuition is something that, particularly in the West, we have virtually no practice with. And not only do we have no practice, but we're typically told to ignore those kinds of conscious hints that come to us. And so I think intuition is just one of those things like attention, that it takes practice and you have to, it takes some training. I think intuition can be trained through life. And you start learning to, like, that there's a wisdom that's far beyond thinking. And when you start tapping into that, it's almost like tapping into some, universal intelligence that seems to be like way beyond any, like the thinking mind is this tiny little, one variable at a time, but this far more vast intellect. And I don't even like to use the word intellect because it's not thinking. I mean, that's the real gift of cosmic intelligence, or whatever you want to call it. It's not thinking one thought at a time. It can hold all the infinite variables all at once because it doesn't have to think. And because it can do that, it figures out the interactions, and I think it just knows it far more. I think it was Pascal said the heart has reasons that reason does not know, and I think that was the hint. And so for me it was like just jump, and the bridge will appear. And I listened to it, and I jumped, and I bailed out of academia. So but that's no different than what anyone else does when they make a big decision in life. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Ian McGilchrist. He wrote a really wonderful book, The Master and His Emissary. And it's really a great book on left-right brain differences. In fact, I'd say Ian has brought back the left-right brain in a much more legitimate way to the field, because he did so much intense research on his book. But one of the wonderful things he talks about the left brain is a bureaucrat. In fact, left brain loves to come up with rules. And that's why, again, when we say we're a left brain society, I mean, think about it. We just sort of would go to work 20 years ago, and we just sort of we figured it out. We played it by ear. Now, when you go to work, you've got a giant manual of rules of here's how you work. Here's all the rules that govern, work behavior and all this. And that's that left brain. It's trying to impose. It's like, well, here's one thought at a time, and I can come up with, here's a rule of how you act at this setting, and here's what you wear at this function. And somewhere in the book he has a wonderful quote where he says that modern society is a bureaucrat's dream, but a poet's nightmare. And so we've got so much, bureaucracy, that it's all left brain imposed, that we're convinced that we can fix a thinking problem with more thinking. That if we just come up with the ultimate rule book of life, it's going to and the wonderful mystery of our existence is that is completely off track. It's so off track, you almost think we purposely threw that just so we could get totally lost in it, and get so lost in it that we finally find that's not it. I mean, sometimes, human beings, we have to get so lost. We have to be in the middle of the woods at night to realize that oh, I am really, really lost. And that sort of is the wake up.
Yeah, and it seems like the reason we make rules is because rules are risk mitigation strategies, right? And there's something about uncertainty and the unknown that the left brain just cannot deal with, because it's designed to combat that. It's designed to preserve and protect and anticipate those risks and those worst case scenarios well before it happens and plan for it. So when you see rules like, on the subway train, mind the gap, like you're telling grown adults not to trip over a gap and fall onto the tracks. I mean, how obvious is that? But that sticker is still there because they're trying to mitigate the risk of that one person who's that absent-minded that they may need to be told repeatedly not to fall into the crack between the train and the platform. And we see this everywhere, right? Signs and even at work, like you said, there's all kinds of protocols to protect workers, to protect employers, to protect management, unions, all of that. I'm sensing some of that in academia might have a connection to do with why you've decided to leave academia. But I'm seeing that in society right now too, right? Like we were talking about the rules of engagement keep shifting in such a way that people are now unsure of what is ethical, what is protocol, how are we supposed to engage now? There's so many often conflicting rules that people feel very kind of trapped by. I wanted to talk a little bit about that intuition and developing that intuition side and why it's important to do it in a structured manner. Because just like you said, you mentioned how in society we're very left brain oriented. I find that, within spiritual communities, it's swung to the other extreme, where people are all about sensing and feeling, and I just have this knowing that this is going to happen. And there's almost an over-reliance on, or an overestimation of the intuitive capabilities, where often they're just making shit up and they're just saying, well, my intuition told me. So where do you strike that balance between the two, where it's not just your left brain putting on its right brain costume and pretending to be all knowing and all sensing and all intuiting? Because I feel like that is definitely a pitfall that a lot of people tend to fall into.
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, I go a little bit into, the next book coming out, I actually use a lot of fallacies in cognitive science that people use their intuitions and they lead them down a bad path. So if I ask you a real simple question, I say, okay, Jim is short, slim, and likes to read poetry. Is Jim more likely an Ivy League English professor or a truck driver? And you're like, your intuitions tell you, well, Ivy League English professor. But then you go through the stats and you can say, well, how many Ivy League schools? Well, how many English departments? And you end up with like, how many short, slim? It's like, well, you deal with 100 people maybe. Well, how many truck drivers are there? Well, hundreds of thousands of truck drivers. So it's way more likely that this person's a truck driver. But our intuitions take us down. We haven't had that instruction to really finally, the feedback to know when our intuitions are absolutely off track. And so that's why I was saying, like, intuition needs training. And intuition can get you into just as much trouble. I mean, all the work on stereotypes were all based on a type of heuristic called the representativeness heuristic, where people they want cartoon versions, and one quality of a person sets off a stereotype, and then they make a decision based on that. We know that that's all takes us down a really bad path. So there are all kinds of ways that we can go down a bad path using what we might call intuition. But again, what I do in this workbook that's coming out, and in fact, it's all exercises. And so it's not much philosophy, but it's exercises so people can get some direct feedback of like, okay, that's when my intuition is off track. Here's when my intuition is more useful. And I think that, it's really just a categorical trick of the left brain to masquerade itself as everything it isn't. And so the left brain is really talented at turning, what do we consider spiritual? I mean, that's why we have kind of a bureaucracy of spirituality right now, which is very, very, paradoxical, I mean, to try to make some rules. But that's what the left brain would love: 7 ways to enlightenment. I mean, it would just be, that book would sell. I mean, it just sounds appealing. Here's 7 paths, 7 steps to enlightenment. And yet at the same time, we all kind of recognize that no, it's not a clear path, and it's it's like that. Here's the way the left brain thinks that life is like this, but life is really like all over the place. And so, but yeah, I think it's just a matter of the same thing you get through meditation and the practice and focusing of attention. It's just you have to go through and get feedback when your intuitions are on track and when they're not. And even then, it's not a perfect It's not a perfect, and even in, teachers themselves, they get thrown off sometimes, and our willingness. And again, one of the wonderful things about the left brain is when they found these split brain patients and the left brain came up with these interpretations, was the certitude that they had. It wasn't like, oh, I think this is what's happening. It was without any question, like, this is what's happening. And so I like to keep that skepticism, throughout the whole process. So like, even when you do jump and even when you do have intuitions, it's like, it's nice to think about the multitudes. There's no one thing up here. And it's like a city, or it's a society of minds, and keep the skeptics around, they have a useful function. And so they keep things balanced. And so.
But one gauge I have for knowing whether my intuition is at least not necessarily true, but coming from the right place, is that there's no sense of certainty attached to it. In fact, it's the opposite. There's highly nervous during the process of making those steps, those decisions. There's a high level of anxiety that you're constantly dealing with, knowing that you're stepping into very uncertain territory, very unknown. And yet that faith is really what keeps egging you on, because intellectually, it's, even to yourself, it sounds like you're on a collision course with disaster, right? And yet somehow in the long run, it all pans out. I wanted to, touch a little bit on that, on what you mentioned about meditation and mindfulness, because, I was a meditator for 20 odd years, and at one point of time, mindfulness and all of these practices were a big part of my spiritual practice repertoire, right? But I've been in recent years kind of critical of some of these practices, not in and of themselves, not as techniques. I think they're useful techniques, but in terms of the results that people propose or sort of put forward that they can achieve. Because for exactly the same reasons we were discussing, the left brain is so adaptive. It can take any one of these techniques and make into another neurotic pursuit. And that's really what happens with most seekers, is mindfulness at one point in time became such an obsession for me. Like, I was 20 times a day checking, am I being mindful? Was I mindful now? Or, oh, wait a second, I asked myself that question, so I wasn't mindful. So now how do I try to be mindful? Oh, wait, I'm thinking about it again. And it becomes this constant pathological self-management game you're playing in your mind. And you couldn't be any less present than when you're trying to be present, is my experience. So again, the nuance and the balance between proposing mindfulness to somebody who's completely lost in their mind and never heard of it can be very sort of impactful and positive. But after a certain point in time, there's a case of diminishing returns that I've seen. So wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, so in my mindfulness class, we would do some mindfulness eating. And it was so cool. One of my favorite days, and it was before COVID, but would bring in all kinds of food, like simple stuff, grapes, and, and do just an hour of mindful eating. And everyone had this tiny little plate. And I'm like, yeah, we're gonna go really, really slow and enjoy every bit of it. And it just blew their minds, literally. I mean, most of them had admitted that they had never mindfully eaten in their life, that every time that they would eat, it was always in front of a TV or social media or a conversation, and that they had this experience so often of looking down and there's an empty pizza box, but they weren't even there to enjoy it. So when you start off like that, and it's like you're surprising someone with this gift, and they had no clue that it was even possible. I mean, I have had students, like, after that day, when we do that, the students would stick around and they just had to express what a wild trip this was for them. And they couldn't believe that, like, they had eaten their whole life. It's like, someone who breathes their whole life and never once was conscious that they were breathing. And so they had been eating their whole life, never conscious of what it is that they were doing. So in that sense, if we catch people who are kind of the opposite, they're so mindlessly going through life, and they're so caught up in the thinking process that they've never even, had a bite of an apple that they were present for. I think that's, revolutionary for them. And it just sets them on this, like, hey, this is possible. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we can, so does mindfulness become this kind of pursuit where, we're so caught up in trying to be mindful that we're no longer mindful. And I think that's one thing I could see that happening. And I never really, I don't know if I got that far with me, but I can see, I could see how the whole spiritual thing can become such a pursuit in and of itself that it ends up turning into its opposite. I mean, the pursuit of spirituality isn't really the pursuit of, I mean, you can't have that, because what you're really pursuing is your idea of spirituality. And then so that's a clever thing about thinking. Thinking has so many interesting mysteries and redirections that sometimes it would be like, okay, well, thinking is my problem, so I have to stop thinking. And then you end up thinking so much about how you're not thinking that you're just right back where you started. And that's why, there are endless games of self-improvement in this sense. But the way I tell the students, I would always say, start off with this kind of epiphany. And I don't ever, don't ever take it seriously. I think that was one of the main mistakes I made, because when you get that first taste of it, and so, like for me, when I was terribly neurotic, and I just said to hell with it, and I said, if you're going to kill me, just do it. And all of a sudden, I got very peaceful. But that's a trap too, because then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I found out this trick that can make me peaceful. And then you start trying to play that trick, and you try to replicate it and say, well, maybe I'll just do that again and say to hell. But now there's a different level to it. You're playing a different game. It's almost like it's not authentic anymore. And so I tell the students to just go really slow with it. Small moves, small expectations, and just come back. Sometimes I don't think it takes living spirituality from morning to night. I don't think you have to move to a mountainside. I don't think you have to change your name. I think it comes down to really small things. Sometimes one conscious breath. You could sit there, just get out of your head, like once a day, get out of your head, and experience, the sensory world, experience what it is to take a slow, deep breath. Or, for me, I love listening to birds. I don't know, I think one time a day of just listening to the birds sing seems to, and then I can get back into whatever, I can get back into the bureaucracy, and that's fine. So I like the idea of balance. The idea of, like, we're human beings, and, this idea that we're going to somehow, turn into this, Zen master. Nothing is more destructive to being a Zen master than wanting to be a Zen master. I mean, if that's your desire, then you've guaranteed that you'll never achieve it. And so, I guess when I think about the left and right sides of the brain, I think about it as like just having, and I think I touched on this maybe somewhere in the book, towards the end of, like, look, you can have one foot in this kind of spiritual stuff and enjoy it, and then you're going to have another in what we call reality, the day-to-day reality that people live. And so, yeah, you're at some sporting event and you start yelling and stuff, and it's like, well, okay, that's fine. You get caught up in a story. I mean, there's nothing sinful to that. You don't have to live 100% of the time in the realm of spirituality, if there is such a thing. To me, these practices have always been, I mean, I have no intention of being a guru of sorts, or, I'm not going to get on some podcast and start talking really slow, for, or anything like that. And this, bad days happen. And in the book, I try to, and it's funny. because in my classes we were talking about the balance of reality, and we're so it's like we have this kind of all yang no yin kind of thing where we're like, have a good day. And I told my students, like, how many damn times do people tell you to have a good day? It's like, it's like this pressure. Like if you go in, you're like, look, it's like you've committed a sin if you're depressed one day. And I think that self-improvement stuff started in the 60s where like we just wanted every day to be like, all positive with no negative. And that's just not the nature of this existence, and not only is it not the nature of this existence, it's actually the bad days are built in so the good days will be really good. I always think if I moved to California or something and every day was 70 and sunny, maybe there would be no more nice days because you wouldn't have anything to compare it with. So my students quickly picked up on this. And so like, they're really careful. They never say, have a nice day. They're always like, well, just have the day you're going to have. And I'm like, to me, that works out a lot better. It's a lot more balancing. It doesn't create some sinful association with the bad, I mean.
Yeah, it seems to me the way the spiritual industry has framed the question of existence itself is flawed because it treats the human condition as a problem. So then it's forced to come up with a solution. It's a very left brain approach, ironically, for an industry that's supposed to be trying to orient people towards right brain use. Is even this idea, in Buddhism of nirvana and all of that, of this image of the Buddha as perfect equanimity and peace and all of that. And I've had this conversation now with a number of people on my podcast as to why that is the image of perfection, or that is the ultimate goal, the image of the ultimate goal in our minds, when life is not constructed to be that. Life is constructed to be the sum total of all experiences, negative, positive, good and bad, all of that. Life, death, and it's so obvious. If you look out at nature, it's obvious. All of that is contributing to the success of nature perpetuating itself. You take any one out of the equation, the whole thing falls apart. And yet when it comes to the human condition, we seem overly skewed towards one aspect because we've somehow framed the other as problematic. Mm-hmm. But for me, the human condition is just constantly evolving, as is our response to it. And so it almost seems like the correct approach, if there's such a thing as a correct approach, would be to sensitize yourself to the evolution of the process and learn how to become more intimate and responsive to the process. Not what kind of response should I have, or not what kind of intimacy should I cultivate, but whatever that looks like in any moment. It could be that the most intimate thing you can do is flip somebody the finger in traffic. It could be. Who is to tell us it's not? I mean, is there a book out there? There are many books out there. But is there one, any one book out there that can categorically say this is the right thing to do? No, there isn't. And so there's no manual on human behavior. So that's that skew that's always bothered me. Because when I started out as a truth seeker, I wasn't seeking any person's version of the truth. I was seeking to encounter truth with a capital T. And now, as I reflect back, I mean, it's the one thing that's most evident to us at all times. We're just forming strategies to constantly look away from it as much as possible because we're not ready to deal with it. And spiritual practices, not practices, but teachings become, in a sense, another distraction strategy. Because they tend to orient away from those negative kinds of experiences towards having wholly positive experiences.
Well, you just hit on kind of a dirty secret of non-duality. It's like one of these things that you get into the non-duality crowd, and it's a fascinating group. But my question is always, well, why duality? Well, if everything's non-dual, why is it playing duality? Because it obviously is. I absolutely feel like a separate. I'm having this sensation that I'm a separate being right now, and why does it appear this way? And it's just interesting that with the non-dual group, you can, have people who really seem to buy into it, but then they get really, it's easy to get them back into the old kind of sin idea of that, like, it knows, well, yeah, everyone is part of the eternal cosmic stream except Trump or something, and it's like they have some, something that, like, and that's fine if there's that realization that, like, me having this feeling is also part of the eternal stream. But I just feel like, the non-duality stuff is, it can be a philosophy or an experience. And I think the philosophy part of it is one of those very seductive ways out, and it can really feel like, because, hey, if it's all one, that's just another way the ego gets to kind of hide its way back into being this eternal, power that never dies. That's the thing that ego fears the most, is it doesn't want to, like, disappear from where it was before it was created. And so, I've that ability to embrace the bad, to so even when I went through my experience a month or so ago, where made a giant leap and had a massive change in life, a lot of friends of mine, they were like, wow, you really seem like you were thrown with this, because I was kind of upset. I was, and I'm like, yeah, I'm a human being. I had some emotions, and, what do you think? I'm a stone Buddha or something? Like, I'm not willing to make, that. I have literally no interest in that. I even did a video on this, like the spirituality of indifference, where it just seems like, that is not my goal. I have no interest in, like, living in a world where, I just sit back and I think, see, that's the thing. I think when you read stuff like Krishnamurti, one of my favorite lines from Krishnamurti is, when he told people, like, here's my secret, and he says, I don't mind what happens. And I think that's a really wonderful phrase, because the mind does create its own problems, and to figure that out is a wonderful epiphany. That I'm creating my own problems, and there is a certain sense where it's like, look, like, if you steal my parking place, I'm probably not going to care. And maybe 20 years ago, maybe I would have gotten upset about it. It's not going to really do anything. But that doesn't mean that I've created a system that makes me impervious to being a human being. I love my kids, I love my wife, that makes me vulnerable. And then it means it's so,
And that's the nuance that's lost, right? When somebody reads Krishnamurti in that line, it almost seems to, it could be interpreted as him saying, well, I'm unaffected. I don't mind what happens. I'm emotionally unaffected. And I would argue that, and Krishnamurti is like, he's someone I read a lot, and I really like a lot of what he says. But, in a public setting, he did have this sort of equanimous kind of persona and all of that. And there is a tendency for people to say, oh, well, maybe that's what I'm going for, is this state of pure flow where shit happens and it's fine. And, oh, wait, I caught myself emotionally reacting to that. That means I'm not where Krishnamurti was. And that's a flaw in logic, right?
Yeah, well, it's not really embracing non-duality first. If you're really a non-dualist, then it's all part of it. You can't escape God in non-duality. So you flipping someone off, or you have, it's all part of it. So, real non-duality, in my view, is like, you can't escape it. It's all it, even when it's trying desperately to not be it. But again, it's very easy to get like one of my favorite teachers. I enjoyed Eckhart Tolle. I really like The Power of Now. I think he's a very effective teacher. But, if someone caught him yelling at, I don't know why I find this image funny of Eckhart Tolle yelling at his cats. It just seems funny to me. But if you saw him yelling at his, would it mean anything to the teachings? To me, it wouldn't mean anything. It would be, it wouldn't be like I would still value him as a teacher. I see he's a human being, and I'm not sure any of the teachers have absolutely escaped their humanity, and I'm not sure that would be the goal. The goal, what I do when I write, is I literally just want to help people catch how the mind creates its own problems. To me, that seems like a fairly reasonable goal, and it can significantly help you through life. But I have no promise to turn you into some spiritual Superman who's going to be, impervious to pain. Part of this life, if you want to love, you're going to feel loss. And even like a job, you may love your job, and when that job is gone, you're going to feel loss. And again, you either embrace the humanity of it, or you do some kind of Freudian denial, in my opinion, and that just makes it a lot worse than before. In fact, it was interesting. I just read an article about one of the Stoics, and how some of his writings suggest that he broke down and cried several times, and people just seemed shocked about that. They were just like, well, how could you have come up with so much philosophy and so many insightful pieces of wisdom? How could you have broken down and cried? Like, that isn't just part of the human experience. I mean,
the adjective stoic now has come to mean not showing vulnerable emotions. When we talk about the Japanese people are very stoic in the face of disaster, they don't seem to get frazzled, is essentially what's being communicated. So right there, you can see the misunderstanding of what the Stoic teachings or philosophy was about versus the manifestation of that in human form. They don't necessarily have to be purely consistent all the time. A philosophy is a philosophy because it is an absolute sort of representation of reality. But reality in a human life is purely context driven. And you can't have an absolutely consistent response to every single event in your life. That's just bizarre. You'd be a robot, right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so inconsistent. My wife says often, like having a conversation with me, she says, I'll give you whiplash because I'll just, like a squirrel on cocaine sometimes. I mean, I go, and I never signed a contract. And I love one of Alan's quotes where he says, you're under no obligation to be who you were 5 minutes ago. You didn't sign some contract with this. And I used to have a lecture, I'd go into that, and my students loved it because it just was so freeing. Like this illusion of consistency that like somehow you signed up somewhere to be a consistent self. It's like, I didn't sign up for that. That's a socially imposed thing that just, from when we were kids, people told us, be yourself, like what play some role in some consistent way. But I forget who said it, but he said, one of these writers, American writers, he said, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. And I just, it's just like you were talking about before, a mystery, there's a connection there. Like to be consistent is something the left brain loves to do because it's predictable and controllable. But whenever we're confronted with a mystery, that's, it's like, it's unknown, it's unpredictable. You don't know where it's inconsistent. And that's, to me, it's a wonderful, I enjoy that world. To me, the coolest thing about this human experience is like, I really don't know what's going to happen in the next few minutes. To me, that I don't want to know what's going to happen.
And I don't want to know who I'm going to be in the next minute. Like I have no expectation of how I'm going to manifest, whether with anger, whether with equanimity. Sometimes I'm surprised, like the same situation on a Monday, I'm losing my shit. On a Thursday, I'm surprisingly cool. And I'm like, why? Why did that happen? I don't care. It's cool. It's nice that it's different because I'd hate to be the same person over and over. It would not be interesting for even me. So that's what keeps my relationship with my wife, my relationship with my kids, always fresh and spontaneous and interesting because we're all showing up as whoever we want to in every moment, right? And none of it is obviously taken to the point of being destructive, right? Being negative. It's just, there's no expectations in that sense. I want to, in the last little bit that we have in this interview, there's a question or subject I want to discuss with you, which I found very interesting. In your book, you touch upon the issue of consciousness. And the reason this was interesting for me, Chris, is because as a neuropsychologist, you take the position that the self is a manifestation of the brain. However, a lot of people out there, when they operate from that position, then kind of extend that or extrapolate that quite to their own minds rationally to say that consciousness is by extension a manifestation of the brain. And a lot of neuroscientists and neuropsychologists take that position because, I mean, they tend to operate from empirical perspective, right? Your own perspective is a little bit more open about it, as is mine, in that even though the self may be somewhat of an illusory function of the brain, consciousness itself doesn't have to be. So did you want to explain that, your
Sure.
perspective?
Sure. And, people often go back to experience with this. And, some of the things about consciousness, it's for a lot of people, it does seem to be locked up in the skull. So they think, well, that must mean, it has to be tied to the brain. And there are obvious ways where, if you spin me around too fast, then the brain, then I get dizzy. So there's some links where it does seem like consciousness and the brain do seem to be influenced with each other. But to me, the brain, so I'll go back to a story from Daniel Dennett, and he wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. And, I've got the book around from grad school. I got so frustrated with it. I ripped it up several times and threw it across the room and all this. And my frustration was because Dennett's brilliant. In fact, his downfall is he's too smart. And what he was really talking about is like, if he just called it The Thinking Mind Explained, it would have been it is a beautiful book, but it's all about thinking. It's about the intellect and how the mind works. He didn't say anything about consciousness. It wasn't one. In fact, he just simply explained it away as an illusion. And so that's why people like myself got quite frustrated with it, because to me, I would put it all completely backwards. I would say that the thinking mind is mostly an illusion and constructs categories and perceptual illusions, but consciousness is actually the only real thing, though it's the only real fundamental existence to this reality. And so it's not to be found in the brain. You can't find it by thinking. You can't find it by intellectual pursuits. And so you say, well, that's why science has been so absolutely, it's failed so miserably. And it seems like these brilliant minds, they keep coming up with more math and more intellectual ways to try to figure out consciousness. But consciousness is not a mystery to be solved. It's an experience to be had. That's the fundamental mistake. It's like we're trying to figure out something that's not it's not some puzzle. Consciousness isn't a puzzle. Consciousness is it is experience. So there's nothing to dissect with it. And so for me, I had some beautiful experiences of consciousness that extended outside the body. And that, to me, this took me on a completely different path. And again, you can argue and say, well, those were illusions. And we know that the brain is capable of so many different illusions. And that's possible. I don't know, but I can only tell you the nudge, the pointers that I seem to have gotten suggest that consciousness is it, that it is, that's the non-dual. It's consciousness, and it's playing everything that it isn't. That's the kind of Leela game of consciousness. Consciousness is playing the material world. Consciousness is playing selves. It's playing you and me right now, and doing a really good job of it. And that's kind of the closest I come to the philosophy of reality. But yeah, we'll never find consciousness in the brain because it's not something to be found. and it's what creates things in the first place. And so for some people that's devastating. They think, because for some people, they love this idea that consciousness is it's just the one neuron away from figuring out consciousness. And I'm not criticizing those people. I think they're on a wonderful ride. They're on a wonderful trip. And so, I'm like totally supportive of them going off on that wonderful adventure. And boy, it's so cool if I was wrong and they discovered the neurophysiology of consciousness and they somehow really did explain it. That would be like, totally wild and wonderful. But I'm just not on that path. I don't think, I think consciousness has no physicality to it. And so it's just not going to, it's what creates the physical world. But that's, I can't prove that to you. That's where the science sort of ends and our philosophy begins, I guess.
Well, and that's where the sort of left brain, right brain dichotomy comes in, is because science, operating mostly from an analytical perspective, is trying to determine causation for consciousness, right? It's operating off of the assumption that there's something prior to consciousness that could have caused consciousness, and then seeing correlations between conscious activity and brainwave activity. There's an implication of, okay, because there's a correlation there must be a causation. And I've heard all kinds of arguments like, well, in deep sleep, you're not conscious, but you wake up and the world has moved on. How is that possible? How could your conscious mind be recreating this? But, those kinds of arguments are easy to pick apart as well. And I'm not asserting here, by the way, caveat, I'm not asserting that consciousness does create the material world by any stretch, and just sort of presenting arguments that would contradict what a lot of that materialist kind of thinking of consciousness being an epiphenomenon of the brain kind of thinking. For example, one of the hypotheses of reality, and again, this is a hypothesis that really appeals to me, is what's known as a simulation hypothesis, that we are living currently in a simulation. And this is not far-fetched because we've technologically advanced ourselves enough that we have now created cyber realities where we inhabit lives of our avatars. And just like I am Advaitaholics Anonymous on Facebook, I can shut my computer down, I can sort of put it to sleep, so to speak. But when I open it up 8 hours later, my page has evolved from there, and the more comments have come on, and hey, I didn't make that happen, but clearly, it's moving on, that it's got a life of its own. And it's not implausible to me that there are civilizations technologically advanced enough to inhabit their own artificial realities. And there's no way to truly know if we haven't already done that, and that we're not inhabiting a matrix kind of reality. So again, this is just hypothetical. But in that case, you would have a phenomenon where consciousness has created this artificial reality that it is then inhabiting. And the brain acts as the correlate to that consciousness within that reality, similar to how I can play a video game character and I can actually shut the game off even from within the game, or I can shut it off from outside the game. There are two different control points. One is inside, one is outside. Who's to say that isn't happening? So, and this is, again, just a philosophical position. It's not any, declaration of this is reality. But the very fact that that's a possibility should entertain enough doubt in people's minds, if they're true scientists, because doubt is the sort of pillar of where scientific thought comes from, to say, hey, let's question our own assumptions. But there doesn't seem to be very much room for that questioning of assumptions, because we've swung from, we've looked at our history as a religious society and believing all kinds of myths about consciousness, to now swinging to the other extreme of saying, okay, we've made up our minds. It's created by the brain, and that's the end of the story. Let's put it to sleep.
Yeah, neuroscience has a lot of that kind of faith-based, the brain is it, the brain is the beginning, the end. And but the ironic thing about that is, even if you're a hardcore neuroscientist, you have to come to the conclusion that it's a simulation. I mean, because, at least on some level, because let's imagine that all the stuff about physical reality is actually true. And let's imagine that everything we know about neuroscience is absolutely true. Well, me looking at you right now, I'm not really looking at you at all. According to neuroscience, there's this photons that are interacting with my eyes that are interacting. And so I'm just creating a simulation of you in my visual cortex. And so the world that you know is a simulation, even according to the most conservative neuroscientist. But so that they can't really find their way out of that one. And so we're kind of stuck with, like, even if you go by the rules of neuroscience, they would say that the world has some physicality to it outside of our perceptions of it. But the world that we know is still ultimately a simulation. And so, and there's no way to get to know the real world, because everything we know the world through the senses, and the senses don't accurately represent reality. They transform it. I mean, there's no way around this. I mean, the nervous system can't form an actual perfect representation of reality. It has to go with what it has, whether it's photons of light or pressure or sound waves. It's taking that external data and it's just interpreting it. And so your simulation isn't the way, and this is the way I understand Donald Hoffman's work, like the simulation that we're experiencing isn't actual real reality. So there's something like this marker. It has some kind of, like, I see it as a marker, but it has some kind of mystical existence that's far beyond my capacity to ever directly experience. And so I think that's kind of cool, that even if you play the game of standard neuroscience, you still end up in mysticism.
Well, this has truly been a fascinating conversation, Chris. I've really enjoyed it because I think we've tackled some of the questions that are on a lot of people's minds, but from different perspectives and from nuanced perspectives. And that's really what I'm looking for, is when I reach out to people to have these conversations, I'm looking to have the kind of conversation people are not privy to when they watch videos on YouTube, because there's a lot of, like, certitude and this position is correct or that position is the absolute. And I think we've explored these topics in a way that leaves a lot of more questions open-ended than lands on any final conclusion. So I appreciate you coming on this call, and hopefully we can continue this conversation at a future date as well.
Yeah, it'd be awesome. It's a lot of fun. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Have a good one then.
Yeah.